Welcome boys and girls, Kostaltyn here with a discussion about Kostaltyn in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. The Supreme Patriarch of the Great Orthodoxy and a true believer, a true zealot of the faith in Ursen. Now Kostaltyn has a couple of advantages in his campaign. One of the more significant ones is actually the fact that he starts close enough to both Azazel and Vlad, and thus can deal with them earlier on in his campaign than many other Legendary Lords. In fact, all other Legendary Lords of Kislev and even Malachi Makason. And that is a pretty substantial benefit because both Azazel and Vlad can become significant threats if you let them. But starting close to them does give you that kind of advantage if you're willing to use it. So that is something worth keeping in mind. But let's talk about his situation with supporters. His victory conditions require him to get to tier 10 of Orthodoxy support level. Now, depending on how you handle this, this could be done in about 30 turns or less of his campaign. Though you will need to fight a bunch of battles against Chaos and get a bunch of structures in order to pull it off. He starts with Eringrad and with Castle Alexandrinov as well. Now, what is important to note here is while you have a good situation in terms of gaining supporters with the Orthodoxy, and you have a permitted Orthodoxy tier advantage of 1 because of your faction effects, one of the problems you're actually going to have in this campaign is getting supporters with Katrin. The reason is that due to the way that Kostaltyn's campaign is designed, and also the same situation applies to Katrin, just in a reverse between Ice Court and Orthodoxy, because of the design of supporters for both of them, you can only really gain supporters with the Ice Court if you fight against their enemies. So you're going to have to engage in a bit of diplomatic bullshit in order to pull that off. And you can start this diplomatic bullshit from turn 1. So here's a couple of things that you want to do. Get a non-aggression pact with the Brotherhood of Bear, because you can confederate them before they get wiped out. And they do start with the barracks and the tier 2 settlement in the Bay of Blades. Also, trade Castle Alexandrinov for the Fort Strakov over here with the Druzina Enclave. This will give you a good amount of money, but crucially, this will also deny Frata and Clean a settlement. So he won't gain as many levels because he's not gaining the experience from taking over the fort over here. And he's not going to have the same kind of recruitment capability. Yes, he will destroy this army, but that's roughly about it. And then you can do the same with Fort Stragov, sell it back, sell Joishnek, and then get the Confederation going with them. That is something that Kostaltyn does have available in his campaign in terms of diplomatic capabilities. But you are going to have to do that kind of maneuvering in order to fully take advantage of this. Because if you play your cards right, you can get the Brotherhood of Bear, you can get the Druzina Enclave, and you can get Prague fairly early on as Confederation targets. The issue you're going to have is that you're going to have to trade Fort Ostrak. Once you do gain it for Confederation, you're probably going to have to trade it to Katrin in order to ensure that you get an alliance with her, she joins your wars, and thus you can gain supporters with Ice Court. Now, having that kind of diplomatic capability actually does permit you, in a certain way, to actually get more supporters with Ice Court than with Orthodoxy, because you only gain supporters with Orthodoxy from battles against Chaos, whereas with Ice Court you gain supporters from any foes they're fighting. Yeah, I feel there's a balance change that needs to be, that Creative Assembly does need to implement with this. Now, your first battle over here, what you want to do is actually ignore the army over there and instead go for the settlement. You might take fewer casualties, and crucially, when that army attacks you, because they will attack you once they have no more settlements, they'll attack Joishnek. You can then just simply turn around and wipe them out. And because settlements have an inherent auto-resolve benefit, you might just be able to auto-resolve your way to victory. You might need to fight this initial battle, but that's roughly it. You do start with 2 units of Streltsy, some light Worstelite, some horse archers, so you do have a good amount of maneuverability on the battlefield, in particular in drawing away enemy forces. Starting with Erengrad, you do have a growth benefit. It isn't as good as getting both Tribal Encampment and Tallow Keeper's Guild, but you don't have to spend money in order to get that to begin with. Though, to be sure, the port itself may be more expensive to upgrade than, well, not necessarily so, right? It depends on the tier that we're talking about, as well as certain upgrades. It's actually the same cost. Okay, I was thought the port was more expensive. It does have less growth, but it does generate trade resources, and it also gives you money. So there's pros and cons with that. Erengrad might grow more slowly than in other situations, but you do have some benefits with it. Another benefit that you have in Kostaltyn's campaign, if you're playing him, is you can use the load save character system. Let's say we get an Ice Witch Lord over here with Architect, but when you're loading a character like this, their trait is not going to become active until you either end the turn or remove them out of province. Having Erengrad right next to the sea allows you to do so. And this is the only Kislev campaign where you can actually do so. You don't start with ice sculpting, so that's probably the first research bit you want to unlock, just largely to get the hero capacity for Frost Maidens, not necessarily anything else. You may also want to get the Frost Maiden over here, and the reason you would want to get the Frost Maiden over here is possibly a recruitment benefit if you want to, though you can obviously use it in Kostaltyn's settlement right there. But yeah, Logisticon, having one saved up, campaign movement range, recruitment cost benefits, it is very much worth it. You do start with the Patriarch, and you do have a fairly significant Patriarch advantage. And yeah, you are allowed to go higher tiers with Orthodoxy before you incur penalties. Now, the penalties can be pretty substantial. If it's just if you're just 1 tier above, it's not really a big deal. It's just a diplomatic downside. But if it's 2 tiers or 3 tiers above, beyond whatever is permitted, then it starts getting ugly. You're talking about devotion. You're talking about research rate. So you don't really want to maximize one side at the expense of another. But that is one of the issues that Kostaltyn does have. On the flip side, it might just work out, but you're probably going to want to keep Catherine alive, at least until you get a decent number of supporters per turn through buildings. But that is a discussion to be had on what kind of buildings you want to get for the sake of supporters. In terms of faction effects, you get a bunch of leadership and melee attack benefits for Kossar units, so Kislev warriors, Kossar units, and horse archer units. So this is all fairly solid stuff. As far as I see it, it does help some of the weaker units you have, units that you would not necessarily bother with as much. But the real significant benefit over here is that 20% ward save for embedded Patriarchs. Now, I do not believe that spamming Patriarch stacks is actually worth it, because they're not durable enough, they're not good in auto-resolve, their combat ability is not necessarily as good as it could be. But it does make them more survivable. See, Patriarchs can be pretty squishy, so giving them 20% ward save does actually help out with that in quite a substantial way. Another thing to also point out is that you can get War Priests, which give you flammable attacks. So realistically, you would probably want to go for Endless March, Duty's Reward, so experience, campaign movement range after winning a battle, or just campaign movement range. Then you might want to get the Land Provides or the Spirit of Community in terms of the Orthodoxy. And I generally recommend when you get that event at turn 5, allowing you to choose between, I want to get a boon for either the Orthodoxy or the Ice Court, I would generally go for the Orthodoxy. It's just the Endless March benefit is pretty substantial. Now, in terms of Lord effects and special skill line, he used to have Frenzy, but now he has Rage. People will consider this a nerf, and there's reasons, fair enough for that. You do get leadership, melee attack, and physical resistance for his entire army. But it is a stacking effect. Frenzy is generally speaking better. However, Kostaltyn does have some really great effects in other ways, at least on the campaign side of things. He does get an additional greater tier difference that is permitted, and then another one. So you can get up to 3 tier differences benefit for the Orthodoxy ahead of the Ice Court. So you can really maximize that kind of Orthodoxy benefit in his campaign in a way that no one else can. And if you confederate Borosurs, this actually ends up being even more significant than that. Okay, so that's one benefit. You then have Aura of Immolation and Blaze of Devotion, so you get flaming attacks for allies in range, melee attack leadership, and weakness to fire damage. You can also recruit Patriarchs in all provinces. This is a fairly substantial benefit, because while, again, you may not want to max out Patriarchs in armies, you can get a good amount of them in terms of recruitment capacity. And so just being able to recruit them on the front line, especially given how squishy it is, can be useful. You also get charge bonus, speed, and immune to psychology for his army. And then you get heroic resilience for his army. If HP is lower than 50%, they get melee defense and leadership. And also unbreakable for him. Unbreakable is not necessarily the greatest benefit, because if a lord is routing, typically speaking, if a legendary lord is routing, you kind of want them to rout. So it is worth pointing that aspect out as a downside. He does get a 20% construction cost benefit for Orthodoxy buildings and a 10% income from all buildings benefit. That is a hefty income benefit that he does have in his campaign that you can use. In fact, I would dare say, like, from a confederation standpoint, Borosurs is the best lord to confederate of Kislev, but Kostaltyn is the second best. Like, the sheer amount of powerful benefits that he does provide you on the campaign map. Like, Astanka has her benefit with Hag Witches, but it's just easier to get Patriarchs than it is to get Hag Witches. Just a tier difference, because you can recruit Patriarchs at tier 2 as opposed to needing tier 3 for them. So just worth pointing that aspect in mind, or increasing capacity for Patriarchs at tier 2. The one discussion on this is you may not be able to mass as many Patriarchs because the building that you get them from does give you Orthodoxy support, and you do want to balance it between that and Ice Court support. But here's the thing. Here's a kicker. The building that gives you 7 Orthodoxy support also increases your hero capacity of Patriarchs by 2. So you can end up with a ridiculous amount of Patriarchs, but also not gain far more support with the Orthodoxy than you do with Ice Court. So if you want to go down that path, which again, I don't think it's a really smart one, you can do so. Like, you can make so many Patriarchs, it's actually ridiculous. In the campaign I was playing as Borosurs, the first campaign I played after the rework, this one, I had like a 50 Patriarch hero capacity by turn 68. That was absurd. That is one of the highest hero capacities I've ever gained in a campaign. To be sure, I wasn't really aiming for Patriarch capacity. I was aiming for getting Orthodoxy support through churches by building them across the campaign map. And there's ways to balance the Orthodoxy as well. Like, if you consider an Ataman has a choice between 5 supporters for the Orthodoxy or Ice Court. It's generally better to go for the Ice Court support because it also gives you 1 Frost Maiden capacity through a skill that gets unlocked with that. Sure, you could go for Orthodoxy support, but it's only going to give you another Patriarch. So if you want to make dozens and dozens of Patriarchs, it is available. I personally don't really think that it is really worth it in a lot of ways. So it is about the manipulation of various factions in terms of diplomacy, getting those kind of confederations like, Brotherhood of Bear. If you sell this element to them, you might get an alliance with them, for instance, all that. Though I would wait 2 turns with respect to that. And you can actually defeat Azazel pretty easily in a campaign. Because while he does have a pretty substantial army, you do switch to this local recruitment capacity here. You do get Kislev Warriors or Kossars if you don't own Shadows of Change. Combination if you do own Shadows of Change, so combination of Kislev Warriors and Kossars. you get a bunch of them, you should be able to defeat Azazel's initial army. The real problem is going to come now from Fraud. That's a bit trickier. And you are going to have a delay in terms of getting tier 2 units, because yeah, you do start with Castle Alexandrinov, but you're going to want to trade it to the Druzina Enclave. But once you do trade it to the Druzina Enclave, you are going to be in a much better situation, and you are going to be able to ensure that kind of confederation. Also, the benefit in dealing with Fraud very early on, it means that the risk that exists on Prague, because Fraud is the main risk for Prague. Catherine can also attack Prague, but it does take a while. Like, she does at least need to defeat these Norskans, then she might go to war with another faction. It takes her a while to decide if she's going to attack Prague or not, but you do remove the principal threat on Prague, which means that Prague can get to a higher tier by the time you can actually confederate them, and that means you can get the tier 3 Prague settlement and then get the landmark over there that gives you a significant global recruitment benefit. So there's a lot of upsides. I'd say the only real downside of this campaign is, well, he's just not as good as Boris Ursus or Estancia is. He doesn't have the same kind of supporter flexibility, but yeah, it is that supporter situation. Another smaller downside, if you will, in a campaign is that Chaotic Wasteland is uninhabitable and Wasteland is unpleasant. I'd say that out of the two, that the Wasteland being unpleasant is actually the bigger issue. If you're playing a Kostaltyn campaign, obviously you're not just going to be able to rush Archeon. And by the time you do go into the Castways, you can genuinely get an Ataman to remove the kind of climate penalties that do get incurred there. And that's kind of your goal. You want to, well, not necessarily go into the Castways, but you want to remove the pressure off Boris Ursus. But it is a bigger issue that you don't have the Wasteland. That is one of the issues I have with this campaign. You can get that climate removal penalty, but it does require you to take control of an entire province to really fully utilize that. So that is a downside when you're talking about this campaign. I do think Boris Ursus and Estancia are better, but to be clear, I think Kostaltyn is in a much better spot. Before 6.1, both Kostaltyn and Catherine were flat not worth playing. They were not worth playing because their short campaign victory condition was ridiculous. It would take you like 100 turns or less, let's say 60, 80 turns to get to that short campaign victory conditions, whereas Boris Ursus can do that in 20. And it's also Estancia. So you would be missing out on that hero capacity. It was annoying. Realistically, you could complete your long campaign victory condition before gaining 600 supporters in the previous system. But now that situation is significantly better, and Kostaltyn, between him and Catherine, was always in the better spot. Just starting close to your enemies, yeah, it can make things more difficult, but it does also give you the ability of dealing with said enemies faster. You could alternatively let Fraud gain Fortress Rock, get the settlement to tier 2, just deal with Fraud along the way, and get armor Kossars as well. That is another advantage. Out of all the Kisavite legendary lords in the game, it is Kostaltyn that has access to higher tier units the fastest. Sure, Boris Ursus and Estancia have much better armies initially, but their recruitment capability early on are more limited than yours. But that depends on how you want to tackle that situation. That's all I had to say. Kostin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.